What can we learn from America's modern First Ladies? Welcome to Leadership and Legacy, Conversations at the George Washington Presidential Library at Mount Vernon. I'm Dr. Lindsay Chervinsky, Director of the library. In this podcast series, we talk with experts about leadership and history, how studying these stories helps us understand our current moment, and how we can apply lessons from leaders in the past to our own lives. Anita McBride is on a mission to share the history of First Ladies and get Americans to understand their essential role in the White House, in an administration, and in American history. This commitment was forged seeing history made firsthand. As you'll hear, she started in the mailroom at the White House and worked her way up to Chief of Staff to First Lady Laura Bush. Now, Anita's the director of the First Ladies Initiative at American University and the author of Remember the First Ladies with Diana Carlin and Nancy Keegan-Smith. In this episode, we talked about the role of First Lady, how it's changed over time, and how it's remained the same. We explore the types of power available to First Ladies and the ways they can demonstrate their leadership. What I love most about this conversation was the respect Anita shows for the different type of women who have occupied this highly visible, controversial, and nearly impossible role. Enjoy the conversation with Anita McBride. Well, thank you so much for being here. I'm so excited to talk about First Ladies with you. We had a wonderful conversation with Catherine Algor about the early First Ladies, and we're going to talk a little bit about what happened after that and up to today and the different types of First Ladies. But the early First Ladies did not have a Chief of Staff. This is a relatively new creation, and some of your incredible firsthand knowledge comes from the fact that you were Chief of Staff for Laura Bush. So what does the Chief of Staff for a First Lady do?
Oh, great question. First of all, thank you for having me. And simply by asking that question or making that statement, not every First Lady had a Chief of Staff. You know, the first First Lady to have a Chief of Staff was Nancy Reagan.
Wow.
And it was a male Chief of Staff.
Wow.
So wow is right. And the first, professional staff position for a First Lady was for Edith Roosevelt, who hired a social secretary because she came into the White House with a big family and also a lot of social obligations, and balancing all of that. She knew she needed help and had to argue for a federally paid position to her staff. So that began the first professional role, and one not to be diminished. The social responsibilities and obligations of the First Lady are significant. But prior to that, First Ladies had servants in the house or people that they paid for themselves. Lou Hoover paid personally for 3 staff assistants, worked out of her bedroom. It has changed over time. I think to describe how the job was for me, I could go from planning a secret trip to Afghanistan in the morning to planning Queen Elizabeth's state visit in the afternoon. So it just ran the gamut of all different levels of responsibility. In the East Wing, it's the best of all worlds of where to work. I mean, you are working on policy and project initiatives that are through the leadership of the First Lady, but also you are the caretakers of the visitors to the house and all of the social events that happen there, the way that the public is greeted, not only from around the country, but around the world. So you really have, as I said, the best of both worlds, working on the ceremonial aspects of the White House as well as the policy objectives.
And what is the integration of your position, the Chief of Staff, but also sort of the East Wing and the West Wing? How does that work?
Really important question to talk about. It works best when people are communicating with each other, right? And I think for me, having a seat at the senior staff table of that the President's Chief of Staff hosted a meeting every morning, and my predecessors, Mrs. Reagan's Chief of Staff forward, had that same access. That's really important for the visual, for everybody on the West Wing side to see that the First Lady's representative is there to report on not only what the First Lady is doing, but to hear what the President is doing, because it is important that there's an alignment of message, of course, an alignment of schedules. You know, for the President and First Lady, it's like any marriage. They don't always talk. So you need the staff. You need the staff to sort of coordinate different things. And of course, planning into the future, any foreign travel or domestic travel, whatever it might be. So that integration, that visibility that not only the First Lady Lady's chief of staff would have, but it has to filter down to other members of the team. For example, our press secretary, Mrs. Bush's press secretary, would sit in on the communication and press secretaries meetings in the morning too. What's the message of the day? Those needed to be aligned. Different positions on our staff would participate in West Wing meetings to make sure that you're moving in the same direction. I think the one thing I would say that really guided me and how I did my job for Mrs. Bush is when I interviewed with her, and she laid down a couple of priorities that she had for now the second term of the Bush administration. But what she said was very striking. She said, I'm not here for me. I'm here for George and because of George. And there are things I want to work on, but I want them to be, and they should be, aligned with what his policy priorities are for the administration. He's the elected official, not me.
You're not the first person I've heard say that about the office of the First Lady. And I'd be curious to know, I had not planned to ask this, but I'd be curious to know if you think that all First Ladies approached it that way.
No. First of all, I would think generally, and the research that we did for the book, when you're reading papers or words in their own writing and you see, their vision for it, they want their husbands' administrations to be successful. They do want that. They don't want to be caught, seen particularly by the press, with the light of day between their policy position that's maybe different than the president's. That doesn't mean they don't have positions of their own. And we do have some first ladies who have spoken out differently by what an administration policy might be. Betty Ford is an example of that, supporting the ERA when President Ford's advisors thought that would be a killer for him in the election. But the president never stood in her way. And how did she get around being a lobbyist, essentially, for that issue when the counsel's office told her you can't make calls to state legislatures from the White House using government phones? Fine. She put in a privately paid for line that she paid for to continue to make those calls. So we know there are examples in our history where they have acted somewhat differently than what the president has wanted.
I imagine there are also examples, there are some First Ladies that did not want to be First Lady.
Right.
And they really wanted nothing to do with it. And maybe either because they didn't want to or they couldn't. So I think there's also that possibility for health reasons or things like that where they just... I think the one that always comes to mind is Bess Truman hated being First Lady.
She didn't like the public intrusion on her private life. And a couple of reasons for that. First of all, let's remember, who did she follow? Eleanor Roosevelt, who had 12 years to be a First Lady and was very active, held 348 press conferences in her time there with female reporters who basically were locked out of the president's briefings. But that was not Mrs. Truman's personality. And she also was worried that the media and the public would find out that her father had committed suicide, which carried a major stigma to it. And it was an intrusion on her personal life. And her mother was still alive. Her mother never really recovered from the fact that her husband had taken his life. So there were some personal protections there. And also Bess Truman would say, I'm not Eleanor. I'm not going down any coal mines. But yet the fact that she was President Truman's most important and significant advisor, bar none. He trusted her completely and was quoted as saying, why wouldn't I trust Bess? She has better judgment than anybody around me. So he argued probably talked to her about every single decision that he made. And one thing, too, about Bess Truman to remember, as a Senate spouse, she worked in his office. She did correspondence. She did constituent mail. She knew what was happening in Missouri. She got to know senators, senator spouses. That all became very valuable behind the scenes advocacy that she was engaged in while she was First Lady.
Wow, that's really important context for us to remember that they are public figures. There are always things that are happening behind the scenes that we don't necessarily know about. And they're three-dimensional, just like we all are.
Exactly.
So in our previous episode, and I encourage everyone to listen to the one with Catherine Allgore, we really talked about Martha Washington, we talked about Abigail Adams, and we talked about Dolly Madison.
Great.
And the sort of early types of First Ladies that one could inhabit. Those are the three sort of tripoles. And then people were, somewhere in between. They made their own way. Could you walk us through, since then, we've obviously had many different types of First Ladies, but there have been points where women who have occupied this office have carved new paths for themselves. They've been a pivot point, they've identified new responsibilities, or somehow broken the mold, or maybe shattered it just a little bit.
Sure.
So could you walk us through some of those moments, help us understand how the position has changed and maybe how it hasn't? My conversation with Catherine Algor, which we published as episode 5 of this season, focused on the earliest First Ladies, so I was especially eager to hear McBride's insights into the role in the more modern era. One thing McBride emphasized is the importance of the historical context each First Lady found herself in, but also the ways in which the role remains, in many ways, a private one.
Well, I think one of the things that we look at in our book, too, is what's happening in the country at the time that these women are serving, right? What's the context, how the country was moving forward, social movements, women's movements, how that, provided a more public platform so that women went from, in this position, and women generally, went from not having a voice in the public square at all to becoming political actors of their own. And so that's a context that I think is important. And then what role can a First Lady have in demonstrating leadership to help push the nation forward a little bit? And for example, Caroline Harrison, who served in the 1890s, women didn't have the right to vote yet then, but, she's asked to, as many First Ladies through history are, asked to be an advocate for a specific cause, raise money for a specific charity. She was asked to raise money for Johns Hopkins Medical School in Baltimore, and she agreed to do it on one condition, that they would admit women on an equal basis for the first time.
Oh my gosh. That's
so
amazing.
What a great example,
Yeah.
right, of sort of using her platform as First Lady before women even have the right to vote. But we do have a number of social movements sort of happening, temperance movement. First Ladies had a role to play in that. Lucy Hayes, right? Lemonade Lucy was a supporter. It was a problem, alcoholism in the country. So that the Caroline Harrison is an example I'd like to point to because I think that's great. Florence Harding for the first Lady to actually be able to vote in 1920 and voted for her husband, Warren Harding, to be president. But she had a keen sense of communications and media. They owned newspaper in Ohio. She ran that newspaper.
Wow.
So she understood the power of communications, of giving women a voice, and was the first to have a demonstrable, example of that. We talked a little bit earlier about Edith Roosevelt not only hiring the first position, but Edith Roosevelt was a conduit behind the scenes for valuable information that was important for Teddy Roosevelt when he was asked to help navigate and negotiate an end to the Sino-Japanese War. And it was Edith who, behind the scenes, was a conduit to information from a British diplomat in St. Petersburg, Russia, that was providing information to her for her husband about what was happening on the ground. Teddy Roosevelt ends up with the Nobel Peace Prize that's sitting there in the Roosevelt room. And all these years that I worked in the White House, I never knew until researching for this book the role that Edith played behind the scenes. We know people like Mary Lincoln. Mary Lincoln probably gets the worst rap in all of our history,
does.
right? Whereas Abraham Lincoln is the most revered and number one of our presidents in any surveys, Mary Lincoln's down at the bottom for a lot of how she was portrayed in the media. Here is a woman who knew she wanted to be First Lady. She wanted to marry a president of the United States. When Abraham Lincoln lost one of his elections, he served in the Congress and then ran for Senate, lost, and President Zachary Taylor at the time wanted to give him the role of governor of the Oregon territories. And it was Mary Lincoln who talked him out of it, said, if you do that, you will be off the national stage. You'll never have a chance to go into national politics. And so here, this behind the scenes understanding, astuteness, political astuteness of these women in our history who wanted to support the idea that their husband could be president and could serve.
Such an interesting element of the First Ladies that you're gesturing at, because it's not just what they did, but why we don't necessarily know about it. I suspect that's for a couple of reasons. One, they often don't want us to know about it. It is supposed to be private. They are supposed to be behind the scenes. But two, if it's a conversation, it's often a private conversation.
That's
and
correct.
We don't always, there's not always a record. And so it's just a good reminder to us that a lot of leadership often does not take place on the written page.
Lindsay, that's what's really important and makes me think about Laura Bush. I always felt about her, she didn't need to be the loudest voice in the room. But when she spoke, whether it was privately or in public statement, people listened because some of it they didn't expect her to say, like the radio address on Afghan women in November of 2001 as an example. But you're you're right about the point of the behind-the-scenes valuable information, unfiltered by arguably the most important advisor most presidents have, and someone who can't really be fired for saying something they may not want to hear, the presidents don't want to hear. But it also, when you asked the question, made me think, too, about Barbara Bush, who was famous for speaking her mind, right? And we knew she had some differing opinions than her husband, pro-choice, gun control. Barbara Bush always worried that she would be misquoted or be misunderstood or say something that would hurt her husband. But she had a very good way of responding to this to her press secretary. She said, if I said it, I said it, and we don't have to try and make a story around it. If I said it, I said it, and I own up to it. But they do worry, first ladies do worry about that. The majority of them do worry about somehow the light of day between them and their husbands is exposed.
Well, because most also aren't politicians. They don't have that experience in their own right, whereas not all presidents, but most presidents work their way up in certain ways, so they've figured out how to do a lot of this.
That's right.
And while, of course, governors' wives have some local attention, it's not the same as the national spotlight.
It is not the same as the national spotlight. And so many, of our first ladies who had been governors' spouses who had that exposure being in the public realm, and Laura Bush was one of them. She said it's completely different when you're in the White House and everything you say, do, what you wear, how you look, of course, is scrutinized. And you have people who come in like Hillary Clinton who have a public profile, already. And as a governor's spouse, she was also a partner in a law firm, and she was very vocal and advocate on issues that she was very experienced in. And so that was a hard transition now to come into this position as First Lady, to follow. It was a major generational shift, too, from the World War II wives that she had succeeded. Also took on a role that her husband handed to her, healthcare reform. But moving an office in the West Wing did not go over very well. And even in her own memoir, she said she had to do it all over again. She wouldn't have done that. And she also would not have taken on the role of actually running healthcare reform. She would have been an advocate. She would have been an advisor, but really recognizing that the country wasn't ready for it.
Yeah, it's a great point. So there are a lot of things that I think are going to sound familiar in what you just described for our listeners. But what would you say are some of the key differences between the early First Ladies and today? And then what has remained the same in that job? McBride emphasized the tricky position of First Ladies as both unelected and potentially very powerful. She discussed how individual First Ladies have navigated these challenges by focusing on special topics that could be seen as advancing the interests of the American people, but crucially, without being overly involved in formal politics. A hard and sometimes impossible balance.
Well, one thing that certainly has remained the same is, first and foremost, they are family members. Their wives, their mothers. They care most about the safety and security of their husbands and their families. That certainly has not changed. That's paramount. The fact, too, that they are, by virtually being spouse of the commander-in-chief, they are the nation's first military spouse. And the concern and care for veterans in our military, that's a thread line that we really can take from Martha to Melania. So that's something that is similar. Obviously, what we said earlier, to the context of what's happening in the country, what expectations are for women to be active, involved, is something that obviously has changed over time, and First Ladies have pushed up against those limits or helped to advance it, or, as we said earlier, did not always feel the need to have a public role. So I think there is, with each person, it's different. And this is the beauty of this position, right? There's no statutory authority. There's no constitutional responsibility, but it is an automatic, powerful platform the minute that the president is sworn in, and how they use it is completely up to them. And if they don't want to do anything, that's also within their purview, frankly. But I think us as Americans, we expect that the platform be used in a way that helps to advance issues that are important to the American people.
Do you think that our expectations of what a First Lady does are reasonable?
You know what? That's a really great way to ask it. I think when you're in the public eye and you have your temporary custodian, these important positions that can actually do something to help people, I think it is reasonable to have an expectation that you use your voice. And maybe it doesn't have to be on every single issue. And sometimes too much you get involved in could actually water things down, right? So Jackie Kennedy was so smart about this. She didn't get involved in everything. She had a singular focus on historic preservation, on education about the White House, about protecting the White House, sharing it with the American people. That was her focus. And interestingly enough, her husband was worried that that was her focus because he thought it would be perceived as very elitist. Yet she created a connection of the White House with the American people that really had not been seen before. But she was limited in the things that she did. But what was interesting about that, when she was visible and was public, people paid attention because they weren't used to seeing it all the time. So I think, do we have a reasonable expectation that the platform be used for something positive? Yes, we do. Do we have an unreasonable expectation that they have to be doing, so much all the time? Maybe so.
I also think it's, in some ways, it's a little bit of a incredibly unfair position to put people in. I mean, it's an incredible opportunity, but it is, as we've discussed, it's an unelected position. It's
non-salaried.
It's not in the Constitution.
That's right.
And so it's really hard to find that fine line that you're describing between involved but not too involved. And what are the issues that are safe for a First Lady to talk about and what are too political, like you talked about with, healthcare and Hillary Clinton. And I suppose one could say that that fine line applies to a lot of women and not just First Ladies.
Yes, and hopefully women in our country can take, this is our idea behind the book, let's highlight some of the examples that actually have helped women gain some agency or confidence that they could speak out or be public about things that they were worried about talking about. Betty Ford's the example on breast cancer. Example. I mean, coming out publicly on that, when the word cancer and the word breast was not mentioned in public, there was such stigma associated with it. But what a classic example of using the platform for something that changed, certainly for women's health, what could be defined in 2 time periods, before Betty Ford and after Betty Ford. That's a remarkable legacy, of course, to leave behind. And it's not like someone told her to do that. She just felt that she had an opportunity to help people. And it didn't stop with her time as First Lady, albeit that was so short. But after she left the White House and going public with the chemical dependency that she had, alcohol dependency, the center that was founded in her name, where it was very interesting. 2 years ago, the Postal Service released a postage stamp honoring Betty Ford. And at one of the speakers at the White House ceremony, Dr. Biden had hosted it, one of the speakers at the ceremony was the current director of the Betty Ford Hazelden Center, who said that every single day, people who are seeking sobriety and seeking wellness walk the same grounds that Betty Ford walked to get healed. They take such strength from that.
Yeah, that is such an incredible legacy. Do you think that First Ladies, how much do they study their predecessors? How much do they learn from failures, mistakes, successes? Do they try and emulate them? What is the role for history as they are crafting their role?
They're certainly very conscious of their predecessors, and you're living with it. Their portraits are all around you, and the presidents are all around you. You can't escape it. And there's some, touches, things that were acquired during their time. We were talking about acquisitions earlier, that you feel certainly their presence. They all want to be their own person, though. They all want to be defined for who they are, what their life experiences have been, what they bring to the role. There are very few cases in our history where one First Lady actually carries on the work of a previous one. We know Lady Bird Johnson continued Jacqueline Kennedy's historic preservation work, and Mrs. Kennedy specifically asked her to. I mean, we don't know of anyone else that actually made that specific request. I do know Laura Bush continued the support for Save America's Treasures, which was Hillary Clinton's work that she established at the turn of the century, at the millennium, about protecting historical spaces as well as artifacts. But I think that, they all want to be measured to be their own person. And in fact, the best way I think I can answer your question is this. In December of 2000, not long after the election, George Bush versus Al Gore was finally decided by the Supreme Court. Laura Bush had an interview with a prominent journalist who asked her the question, well, Mrs. Bush, are you going to be more like Barbara Bush or are you going to be like Hillary Clinton? And as if she couldn't be her own person. And her answer was very simple. No press secretary could have prepared her to say it. She just said, well, I know Laura Bush pretty well, so I'm going to be her.
I love that.
I mean, that's a great response, right? And that just shows you that there's a certain level of confidence you have to come into this role in, but you recognize you may never totally be measured for who you are and what your life experiences are. You are going to be measured or defined by those that come before you.
Yeah, I think it does take a certain confidence in your own skin to try and be your authentic self, or as much as you're willing to share.
Exactly.
Anyway,
that's exactly right, because there is a certain protection that they have of their private lives, yet they want to be seen, as you mentioned earlier, three-dimensional, not one-dimensional.
That's a really good point.
Experience leadership like never before at the George Washington Leadership Institute. Inspired by the timeless lessons of George Washington, our programs focus on critical skills like effective communication, emotional intelligence, adaptability, strategic vision, and character-driven leadership. Immerse your team in a journey through history while equipping them with strategies to navigate today's complex challenges. Join us at the beautiful George Washington Presidential Library at Mount Vernon for a half-day or full-day sessions, or customize a program to fit your needs. Visit gwleadershipinstitute.org to learn more.
So in this book, you talk about 3 different ways that first ladies in the modern period have demonstrated leadership. And you talk about communication, you talk about campaigning, and you talk about preservation. Could you talk about those 3? I then wanted to focus on the idea of leadership and first ladies, using the themes in McBride's new book. McBride emphasized how first ladies have both taken advantage of the increased role of women in the public sphere and sometimes pushed for those changes themselves. We also talked more about the difficult but potentially very powerful role first ladies play in relation to their husbands' policies, as both supporters and potentially as offering a slightly different message, which can reach different audiences. Finally, she emphasized the crucial role first ladies play as custodians of White House history.
Sure. Communication, exactly what we mentioned earlier, too, as women's voices in our country and in the public square increased. I mean, we have examples, of course, of our first ladies who have used that. Lady Bird Johnson, she owned radio stations in Texas. She was a very wealthy woman, graduated from University of Texas at Austin with a degree in journalism. She knew the power of communications. We had mentioned earlier Florence Harding ran newspapers, right? Abigail Adams would plant stories about John Adams in the paper. Julia Tyler would plant stories about herself. She wanted to be seen as a beautiful, young, vibrant first lady. Some are more comfortable with it than others. Some are more skilled with it than others. But the power of rhetoric and communications is something that we do examine. Of course, Eleanor Roosevelt, as we mentioned earlier, just the power of understanding the press and giving more women an opportunity to have access to important information from the White House by hosting female reporters. And of course, interestingly enough, in the 20th century, there are 4 speeches that are considered some of the top 100 of the 20th century, which measured by these rhetorical experts and scholars. And 2 of them were given by Eleanor Roosevelt to the United Nations Human Rights Commission, which was post First Lady life, of course. One by Hillary Clinton, the speech in Beijing, the women's rights and human rights speech in 1995. And the one that surprises everybody the most is Barbara Bush's speech in 1990 to Wellesley College graduates, where she had been invited to speak, but it was met with incredible uproar. The women who had signed, the graduating class had signed a petition, said she earned her position solely by virtue of her husband and not through anything she did herself. And she could have said, okay, I won't come deliver the speech, but she went and turned the negative situation around completely, had some really important life messages in that speech. It was very short, went up to that speech not knowing it was being carried live throughout the entire country. And
Listeners, my jaw just dropped, just so you know.
I mean, incredible, right? And ended with foretelling the future and with humor. Basically, who knows? Somewhere out there may be someone who will be in my shoes one day, and I wish him well, meaning foretelling a female president. This was in 1990. So again, just turning that really powerful use of language. It doesn't have to be a lot of words. It was a short speech. It was 12 minutes, but it really made a difference. So again, as women's voices changed in our country or were more visible, first ladies have certainly tried to use theirs. On politics, we know with some first ladies were great campaigners. I mean, Eleanor Roosevelt, some of the first lady to actually address a national convention. We know that Nellie Taft went to both conventions, both the Democratic and the Republican convention, didn't speak, but her presence was a really bold step. So I just think it's an important aspect, of course, of American life, how you communicate your message, not only for what you're doing, but how you shine a different light on the president as well.
I think that point is so important because so much of leadership is knowing it's situational awareness, and it's knowing your role in a situation. And, Washington was great at this. He understood that the goal was not to beat the British Army, but to survive the British Army. And that is, far less sexy than winning big battles sometimes on the field. But
That's right.
If the goal is to survive, then sometimes the big battles aren't the idea. And I think the first ladies who are quite savvy understand the opportunity. They are often the person who is giving authenticity to their husbands, to show the other side and to show the side that most people don't see, whether it's humor, whether it's funny stories.
Family life,
exactly. And I don't think we always see that as leadership, but if you don't recognize the opportunity in that situation, it seems like you're really missing something.
Well, absolutely. And I think, let's think about the basic concept here. Every problem in the world comes to the desk of the American president, right? And first ladies are lucky. They get to pick and choose how they want to deploy their influence, and whether it's overt, outward in public, or whether it's behind the scenes as a support to the president, to their husbands, being very conscious of the situational awareness when it's important to get out there and be visible or show a different side of the president. That is all value added to a position that is arguably, of course, the most difficult in the world. And they are the one person who could tell the president what he doesn't want to hear as well. But they don't often do that publicly. They'll do that privately. The one recent example of that is different, though, that I think we need to mention, in the first Trump administration, we know there's examples where Mrs. Trump had a different public statement than her husband did. During COVID was one example of that. He was telling American people, you don't need to wear a mask, don't need to social distance. But yet she recorded public service announcements for the Centers for Disease Control at the front door of the White House, telling people to wear a mask and to social distance, to listen to the guidance that they were being given. She didn't get credit for doing that. That is a great example of saying she had a different opinion on how this should be handled and voiced it.
So the last one, I'm actually going to add one. I mean, you've touched on this a little bit, but first ladies are often representatives for their husbands. We talked a little bit about campaigning, to be sure, but especially with the advent of modern technology, they are often travel representatives.
Yes.
I'm wondering if you could talk about that role, because we, as a culture that does not always appreciate foreign affairs like we should, I'm not sure we pay attention to those responsibilities and the time and how important it is.
So glad you asked that question, because it gives me an opportunity to really talk about one of the most underreported, underappreciated first ladies in our history, and that's Pat Nixon, who is the most traveled first lady in history, and also served this role as second lady as well. In fact, President Eisenhower would tell his vice president, Dick Nixon, whenever he was sending him on a foreign mission, take Pat with you, because she was so effective.
Yeah.
And back to the point you made earlier about they give a softer side to their husbands. If anyone needed that, it's certainly Richard Nixon. And so Pat Nixon was incredibly effective as a foreign emissary for our country and for the American people.
What made her effective?
The way she connected with people. People were her project, and that's what she said. She was off the beaten track of the scripts, that the schedules that the embassy would give her and the ambassador and their team would give her. She wanted to go and meet people where they were at, and go to the orphanages, go to the hospitals, go to the schools, go see the cultural performances, see the marginalized. This is who she was. She had a pretty hard life before she became first lady. She always felt connected to people that needed hope and needed a kind word or someone who noticed them. And so she was effective because she connected so warmly with people, even though it's so interesting the way she was perceived by the media and others as plastic, because she was more quiet and demure in vis-a-vis her husband's administration. But on her own, when she was unleashed, she was incredible. She's the only first lady in history to actually be given the title personal representative representative of the president when she traveled overseas. She spoke to 3 African parliaments. She went and led the relief mission to Peru after a devastating earthquake there had decimated nearly half of the country, climbing rubble in her skirt suit and heels. And in fact, the president of the country, newly elected president of Peru, where there was a lot of anti-American sentiment, had said after her visit that she was there meant more to the people of his country that the president's wife came than if he had sent the entire American Air Force. I mean, that was the power of Pat Nixon connecting to people who needed to feel seen, heard, cared about. I just think that as far as the representing us overseas, she was an extraordinary American diplomat. And in the modern presidency, of course, most of our first ladies have traveled quite a bit.
The last piece is
Yes.
preservation. Could you tell us a little bit about why this is something that first ladies do and why it matters?
First ladies, when they come into the White House, they really do feel the responsibility of the preservation of the White House, the protection of it. The artifacts are there, the history that's told there, that unfolds there every day, families that have lived there, what we can learn from, what children in our country can learn from what happens at the White House. We know certainly Jackie Kennedy changed the game on how we tell our preservation story about the White House, the founding of the White House Historical Association as the private partner. She knew there would never be enough government money to do this right. But first ladies before her had felt this sense of responsibility. Poor Caroline Harrison that climbed through the rodent-infested attic of the White House to find pieces of furniture and artifacts that were up there, tried to do the first documentation. Lou Hoover personally paid for 3 members of her staff to document what was in the White House collection. Nobody had really cared about it before, but they do feel this sense of responsibility and the weight of it. This is one of our most recognizable symbols of our country around the world. So once you're living there, you're surrounded by the history, you're now a part of it. You want that story to be told. And again, for Mrs. Kennedy, when she did that walk and talk in February 14th of 1962 on black and white television with CBS News and really created this incredible connection between Americans and their White House. And I think that set the stage, certainly for the future of how important that is for them to be caretakers and custodians in that temporary period that they get to have that privilege.
The White House, I think, is a very visual reminder. I mean, it's obviously a very useful tool for statecraft. It is an incredibly important part of our political imagination. It is a very recognizable symbol. It's a very interesting sort of historic artifact in and of itself. But it's also, I always saw it as a reminder that the presidency is the most powerful office in the world. And it does not belong to one human. It is so much bigger than one human. And the people who are in it, we treat as something else while they're there. But it doesn't actually make them something else. It's really about the office. And that we are all, when we're not in the office, we are all citizens. And so to me, it's such a helpful reminder whenever I'm there that it's really about the office. It's not about the people.
It's important to always remember that it belongs to all of us. The White House belongs to the American people. We elect people to be temporary custodians of who we are as a nation. And I think that's an incredibly important responsibility for a president and certainly for their spouse to help echo that. And I think I want to say one last example, if I could, about that responsibility to protect this symbol of our American democracy and our system is the quiet Bess Truman who learned the skills of how you work with Senate appropriators, with the decision makers on Capitol Hill simply by having been a staffer to a senator. But when did that really become important? It became important when she was First Lady and the White House had to shut down for 3.5 years to be completely rebuilt. And the Congress, of course, wanted to go the cheapest route, and that was to tear the building down.
Oh, no.
And it was Bess Truman who really worked behind the scenes saying, if you do this, the American people will never forgive you, to remove what is such an important symbol to them. So when you see the White House, we think about everybody that has lived there, the things that have happened there, but we do have Bess Truman in part to thank for protecting what is the most visible and recognizable part of the White House. It's its exterior.
Yeah. There are so many things that we think of in the American story in terms of the White House, and we really only know a tiny fraction of what actually happened within those walls.
There's so much out there, and it's great. And, we'll never fully learn everything, but it's really fun finding the information and the history and the facts.
It is. Well, because you have such great firsthand experience, I'm wondering if a story that you feel comfortable sharing about a moment that you saw First Lady leadership in person or that really struck you about the potential and the power of the First Lady. I couldn't pass up the chance to ask McBride about her own experiences with First Lady Laura Bush. She emphasized the impact of Bush's travel for in-person visits, both at home and abroad, and the crucial importance of showing up.
A couple things. I'll give you an overseas example and then, of course, an at-home domestic example. But we did, in my time with Laura Bush, we traveled 67 countries in 4 years out of 77 that she did total in 8. So it was a busy, very busy second term. I mean, she was really leading the charge of the major global health initiatives that the president had launched, emergency plan for AIDS relief. Mm-hmm. For sure, we made 15 trips to Africa.
Which was really one of Bush's most important legacies.
Absolutely, a signature legacy and can be measured with having saved 26 million lives to date. So she was a great face of that and the American people's compassion. And she would talk about that when overseas. This is due to the generosity of the American people. It was her husband's initiative, but it wouldn't have happened if the American people, in their capacity to be generous and compassionate, did not approve it. And so I saw her firsthand working with a lot of her counterparts. Women around the world, in particular all the time we spent in Africa, who had this role as a similar role and felt the responsibility and the weight of responsibility of being mothers of their country and didn't all have the infrastructure like our first ladies do. Mm-hmm. We have a plane, you have an office. I mean, you have a lot of support and really drawing strength from our example and what they could do with their role. I really admired how these women wanted to find things that they could do with each other, with the American First Lady. I think that was a great example of just how impactful the role can be. And then I would say, domestically, the travel that really impacted me too is Laura Bush made 26 visits to the Gulf Coast after Hurricane Katrina. Most people don't know that. I mean, when a job training program was opened or a new playground or a school was rebuilt or a restaurant or hotels, she was down there showing support for the rebuilding after this incredible, largest natural disaster in our country's history, for which she knew her husband took a lot of criticism for, fairly or unfairly. There were a lot of people to blame at all levels of state and local and federal government. But she never shied away from going down there and showing support for the rebuilding effort, bringing comfort, bringing hope, reminding people there as they were going through this struggle, they weren't forgotten in Washington. That really, I never lost sight of how important that is simply by being there. That is such a good use of the role. And I think our last trip that we made, Mrs. Bush wanted to get to all 50 states. And so we were really at the end making sure we got to everything that was on her priority list. And so the 50th state was North Dakota. Oh. And it was in the middle of winter. It was December. Oof. It was pretty cold there. But we arrived and we get off the plane, and down at the bottom of the plane on the tarmac is a little group of second graders. And they were all dressed in patriotic costumes, that were made by the school or the parents, whoever it might be, with their little striped hats and red, white, and blue uniform. And they are reciting the Pledge of Allegiance for the First Lady of the United States in North Dakota. And I thought, this is what it's really all about. How many times had a First Lady actually gone to North Dakota? I don't think many. So that was an example of just how important it is. You've got to get out of Washington. You've got to get out there to, the American people. They need to see you. And that day ended in a church basement at a potluck supper. And everybody brought the food, and we're all sitting paper napkins and paper plates. And just spontaneously, an elderly gentleman got up and started singing, "God Bless America." And I saw Mrs. Bush got emotional of it. When I got emotional of it all, everybody it was such a reminder, Lindsay, we're a great country. And it's made up of people who do care about the country and are proud to be Americans, are proud that they're being recognized for their role in their small town and community. And it was one of the most memorable of all of my travels in all these states and all these countries, was that one moment with those kids and in that elderly gentleman.
That's incredible. The message I always take away from that is so much of leadership is just showing up.
Showing up.
It's such a huge part of it.
Right, exactly. And people feel seen, wanted, and appreciated. And I loved that part of it.
Well, our final two questions. Sure. So I always like to, our audience is a good reader audience, which we applaud. So what was one book that you read that taught you something about leadership?
I love Lady Bird Johnson's diaries that she recorded in real time while she was a first lady. She spoke into a recorder and they were all transcribed. In fact, I gave that book, I found a first edition signed copy on eBay that I bought for Mrs. Bush as a birthday gift when I was trying to encourage her to keep a journal or a diary. So when she went to write her own book. But back to Mrs. Johnson, the recording of real time, the experience of being a wartime first lady, Vietnam War, the protests happening outside the White House, the struggles that her husband was facing, their family life in the White House, the civil rights work that she was engaged in, the Head Start work she was engaged in, really reading in her own words, her beautification work. The Highway Beautification Act is because of Lady Bird Johnson and why that was so important to her, for Americans to feel connected and protected of their natural landscape. I loved her diary. I think it's really one of the best of First Lady biographies and works out there. It is definitely one of the best.
That's a great recommendation. And our standard final question is, when you think of George Washington and leadership, what do you think of?
Boy, person who set the precedent, the struggle, the sacrifice without any guarantee that this nation would survive. That example of strength, foresight, sacrifice, commitment is just something I think as we inch towards our 250th birthday as a nation, that we look to those examples of really putting it all out there for something that is bigger than you, that had no guarantee, had no precedent. It is the quintessential story of the American experience. And I just think, and every time I come out here to Mount Vernon, as I mentioned to you earlier, I'm spending more time out here. And I really do, I feel, and even walking down to this studio, you feel the weight of telling the story to new generations of what a figure like George Washington, imperfect, because we're all imperfect, but really what they put on the line for something that they had no guarantee it would work, but it was worth it.
Well, thank you so much. And thank you for your time and sharing your wisdom and experience with us.
Oh, thank you for having me. I really appreciate what you're doing.
Thank you for joining us this week on Leadership and Legacy. And thank you so much again to our guest, Anita McBride. You can find her new book, Remember the First Ladies, The Legacies of America's History-Making Women, which she co-authored with Diana Carlin and Nancy Keegan-Smith, wherever you buy books. I'm your host, Dr. Lindsay Travinsky. Leadership and Legacy, Conversations at the George Washington Presidential Library is a production of the Mount Vernon Ladies Association and Primary Source Media. In the spirit of George Washington's leadership, we feature the perspectives of leaders from across industries and fields. As such, the thoughts expressed in this podcast are solely the views of our guests and do not reflect the opinions of the Mount Vernon Ladies Association. To learn more about Washington's leadership example, or to find out how you can bring your team to the George Washington Presidential Library, visit gwleadershipinstitute.org. Or to find more great podcasts from Mount Vernon, visit georgewashingtonpodcast.com. You can also explore the work of Primary Source Media at primarysourcemedia.com. Join us in 2 weeks for our next great conversation.